Well, good evening, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome once again to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives, and tonight I'm really happy to be presenting a special show here from our good friends at the LaRouche organization, and David Shavin will be talking to us tonight about. I asked him to explain to us what is the big strong connection between LaRouche and the Schiller Institute and all of you folks really that really is part of, I think, part of core of who you guys are, and that is your relationship with Schiller, with Friedrich Schiller, and also with the great classical musicians, and right at the top of that list has got to be Ludwig van Beethoven. So we talked a little bit. We've been back and forth on our email messages, kind of narrowing it down. There's so much we could touch on. I know we also want to bring in some of the politics around the French and American revolutions tonight, and see how once again it's shown that the arts are a very, very strong force, if not, as some people would say, the leading force in political change. But that's enough out of me. Let's introduce David and ask you, David, to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll get into our subject for tonight.
Oh, okay, fine. Thanks for having me and Schiller Institute on again.
Oh yeah.
I've been. I actually came in Tennessee from a civil rights background. My parents were active. I was at Highlander Center when I was 5 years old when Dr. King came to visit with Rosa Parks in 1957, and was at his funeral in 1968 when I was 15 years old. And I was convinced that the quality of leadership, I was just worried as a young man whether I don't think a republic could work with the way we bandy around slogans and nonsense. Anyhow, I ran into LaRouche's movement in the early 70s, 1970s, and been active, organizing, writing, researching, really since then. What's it, about 47 years by my mathematics. And I learned a couple things along the way.
Well, it sounds like you and I are just about exact contemporaries, although I did not grow up in the civil rights movement. But I sense that that is another common bond of a lot of you folks with LaRouche and Schiller is an early exposure to the terrific problems with justice and violence in this country, and trying to find some way to identify, how to move forward, how to move forward. And of course, Mr. LaRouche provided a lot of that leadership that folks were looking for. But yeah, let us now turn a little bit towards what I really want to get into, and that, well, Beethoven was always a big part of my life. When I was young, because of my father's influence, became he loves Beethoven, so I had to love Beethoven too. So I got I had all kinds of records and LPs, and really, I mean, fell in love with that feeling, that incredible feeling that's so unique in Beethoven's music. It's something that just grabs a hold of your heart and carries you forward. Well, again, enough out of me. Let's hear what you have to say about the relationship between the LaRouche movement and Ludwig van Beethoven.
Well, LaRouche wrote a famous article years ago, "Think Like Beethoven," and the idea there is not. Well, I'll put it this way: it goes along with the conference which we'll be having tomorrow. You take a situation, any horrible situation, like presently with Afghanistan, and people say you pull out, you don't pull out, you lose either way. There's a way to lose either way. And this method of thinking like Beethoven was also identified with a thinker named Nicholas of Cusa called the coincidence of opposites. where this world's created in such a way that when you think there are two things opposing each other and there's no, best you can do is to get reasonable and try to make a compromise between the two, somewhere in between, like Congress making laws like, baloney and that type of thing. But in fact, the world's composed from a higher standpoint, where there's a higher harmony, and you have to look into what creates the difficulties on either side and have the confidence and the optimism that there's a higher solution. With Afghanistan, for example, presently, it's pretty obvious. It's the America that Beethoven fell in love with. Where you have a republic, well, with Afghanistan, where we know if you turn loose the civil engineers and the scientists, the way that was done with Tennessee Valley Authority, or the way the Chinese have done with their recent hydroelectric projects, there's no objective problem having a solution where different ethnic groups aren't getting along, where there's enough for them all to have enough for their kids and their families and their futures. And they don't have to think small, yet they have to think big. This happened in the 1950s and 60s in Tennessee, in Chattanooga, where I was from, with the Tennessee Valley Authority. You didn't have to be politically correct on you didn't have to adopt friends based upon agreeing with every small thing. You knew there was a future because this country was better than any place in the world in bringing online qualitative, massive, large infrastructure projects. And the world's created that way. Thinking like Beethoven was between 11 and 13 years old when he was 11 years old in 1781, when the world turned upside down on the British Empire. These bunch of radicals in the American colonies at Yorktown took over, defeated Cornwallis's army. It took a year or two, 1783, before the British formally signed their surrender. But this was a formative matter as Beethoven's studying music, and he's studying, in particular, Johann Sebastian Bach and his well-tempered clavier. There's a new hypothesis on the table, where the future is you don't have to be royalty to be important person to making history. You can, and Beethoven took that quite seriously. And the problem for Beethoven was the French Revolution between 1791-92 period and 1795. It was horrible. It was worse than any violence the United States has seen. Even almost you had to go back to the Civil War to get something close, where the revolutionaries were just turning on everybody. I guess presently you have with identity politics, and you have knocking over statues. The whole game is what you're against, blaming somebody else, and that was the French Robespierre and the Jacobins, where one group would take power in 1792 and they get overthrown the next year. Now Beethoven is 22 years old when this is happening, 22 to 25 years old, and he actually moves to Vienna. Well, let me back up. The key to Beethoven's opera Fidelio, which he wrote when he was 33, is that the opera was modeled on the Marquis de Lafayette and his wife Adrienne, who were imprisoned. The opera is about a political prisoner, and the wife is not very political. She's just a woman who truly loves her husband. It takes a couple of years before she finds out what secret prison he's been placed in, and she ups and moves to that town where the prison is. Before I go on more on that story, Lafayette fought for the American Revolution, volunteered as a young man in 1777, even before the French court had officially agreed to align with the United States. Lafayette was the key person for the faction in France who didn't want to simply get back at the British Empire, but actually wanted to create a republic, to end the rule of kings and queens, and to create a situation where the country was going to be as good or as bad as the quality of citizenry that you had. So there's a vested interest in having public education, having better skills for the next generation than the former generation, having not cycles of boom and bust, but actually having permanent progress. So Lafayette was that representative, and he was one of the leaders in France in 1789. He is the guy who wrote the new Constitution of France in 1789, when there was a possibility of making an American Revolution in Europe. And a lot of the last several hundred years has been colored by the fact that the American Revolution worked and the French Revolution was a miserable failure. So between 1789 and 1791, Lafayette did his best. But by 1792, the situation had degenerated. The Jacobins took over, overthrew the government, overthrew the Constitution that Lafayette had written. And it just became, and Lafayette, who was a general in the French army, trying to stop the monarchists from invading, the monarchists from Austria and Germany and Prussia and the British Empire from invading France. It was a real, what they call a gang, counter-gang situation. You had crazies inside France, you had crazies on the other side, outside of France. And your listeners should identify with the non-choices people have been given by the media in terms of what you're supposed to line up with today. But this is the Lafayette situation. He tried to, he headed out to America. He was going to the American embassy in The Hague, and he got captured along the way and imprisoned in 1792, and he was in prison for 5 years. And his wife, ironically, was in prison. He was in prison for being a French revolutionary. He was in prison by the monarchist. His wife was in prison at the same time by the Jacobins, by the anti-monarchist. They were both in prison as being dangerous enemies of both the monarchist and the mindless revolutionaries, the Jacobins. You can call them the righties and the lefties, but I don't know how helpful that is. Mm. And this was a big story in Europe. There was a lot of people. It was a messy situation, but Lafayette was uniquely the man known for the American Revolution, for being friends of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. And both Washington and Hamilton spent several years trying to get Lafayette out of prison to free him without getting involved in the European wars. Washington didn't want to, he had to balance the situation. So Beethoven, Lafayette does get freed finally in 1797. His wife had been freed in 1795 when the radicals in France had been overthrown, the Robespierre crowd. However, shortly before she was freed, she was there in the French prison with her sister and her mother and her grandmother, and she watched them get taken away one day in July of 1794, and all three of them guillotined. And she would have been guillotined herself, except for the actions of the American representative in France, Gouverneur Morris. And so she was saved. As soon as she got out of prison, she decided she's going to go over to Austria, confront the emperor, and demand that her husband be released from prison. The emperor gives her a choice, which he later regretted. You can see your husband, but if you see him, you have to stay in prison with him. And she said, fine.
Like Aida or something. I mean, that's operatic.
Right. It is. Yeah. So she was in prison for the last 2 years with her husband. And they have a bunch of, there's correspondence you can read where they both say it's not the Austrian Emperor Franz II who's really imprisoning them. It's not the Prussians. It's actually William Pitt and the British Empire, for reasons that Lafayette's not simply another French revolutionary. He's the American. It's for the American Revolution that he's being imprisoned, even though that was 10, 15 years earlier. And that's the reason. And so in 1797, the Napoleon's army is about ready to take over the military defeat of Austria. And Carnot and others in France demand that Napoleon make it a condition that Lafayette gets freed. And the whole population in Paris is getting, not a large part of the Paris population, very excited that Lafayette might get freed. And there's plays and operas written about this the whole year. And one of the plays is the one that Beethoven picks up 6 years later in 1803. It's called, at the time it's called Leonora, or A Married Love, L'amour conjugal. And it's about, no musicologist will tell you this today. It's just a rescue story. It has nothing to do with history. Beethoven, it's provable. Beethoven was dealing with the French groupings of Lafayette, who wanted to try to get Napoleon not to be an idiot and an emperor, but try to get him in the direction of a constitutional monarchy, at least if not a constitutional republic. And so thinking like Beethoven is that Beethoven was in the situation where there wasn't an obvious way out today for Afghanistan or the United States policies, or back then for France, which was the country at the time that was supposedly the best hope for spreading the American Revolution in Europe, into the world. And the world people should just stop getting used to the idea that there was one American Republic, and otherwise they're just a bunch of kings and queens for another 100, 200 years, and that's how it had to be. It's not the case. So both Beethoven and Friedrich Schiller, the German poet, knew that they had to enrich the culture to make a republic. You can't just. What went wrong with the French Revolution was it was a difficult thing to try to accomplish. They had a vastly uneducated peasantry using largely backward techniques on the land. The United States in the 1770s had a much more literate population prepared to use much better farming techniques and to think better for their kids and grandkids. In France, it was the William Pitt and the controllers could plan out, could depend upon the rage in the population to be mobilized on chopping off the heads of people, and that was going to solve their problems. They could be angry about the former luxuries of the kings and queens and chop off their heads, and that will solve their problem. And that's not organizing. And so Beethoven was a matter of a republic is no better or worse than the cultural and skill level of your population. And you can say the same thing. Alexander Hamilton agreed with the same thing. Printing money is no better or no worse than the projects that stand behind it. Money's not magic. Everybody has wild theories about this stuff. And the real underlying heart of the matter is leaders in a republic have to be committed for moving a population forward. And people can say that sounds paternalistic or whatever they want to say. So Beethoven should probably plunge into a little bit of what he did with the music. People, first of all, after this, just need to go listen to the opera. The easy way out is they can go look up on EIR, November 13th article I wrote on this story, which has the virtue that it has some links in it where I've put some of the highlights, some of the 2 to 5 minute little musical highlights, video highlights. People can see what the main points are of what Beethoven did in his cultural intervention. John, you want to go through?
Yeah, may I just go back? I want to recap some of the stuff that you've just been over, because some
Sure.
of it a lot of it's new to me, and I think this is really important scholarship, if in my humble opinion, because Fidelio is an opera that hardly anybody ever wants to go see. It's just not one of the big hits. There's no Toreador song, I mean, it's not Puccini, and it's not it's just not one of the big hits. But if people could understand the thinking behind it and the relationships that you just explained, and I'm sure that it's easier to catch it by reading the article. But then I think it would inspire an interest in the opera and the personality of Beethoven himself, which I mean, we tend to put him on a kind of a pedestal, like like our little bust here. And not think of him as a human being that was truly inspired by the American Revolution and the story of Lafayette that you recounted there so You know, that's fascinating, and congratulations on your article.
Thanks. I mean, maybe I'll make it a little bit easier. Beethoven studied more an opera that maybe people can first try out, Mozart's Magic Flute. It was an important opera for Beethoven. The Fidelio operas, they're very different in a lot of ways. But there's one thing that really Beethoven took from Mozart's Magic Flute in his thinking through what he had to put in front of the population of Europe in 1803, 1804. And that in the Magic Flute, people think it's a fantasy story. Children can go see it. It's a lot of good tunes in it. But the core issue there is that the ruler of this kingdom, Zoroastro, is a wise fellow. He's got beautiful art, beautiful architecture. The people love him. He seems to be very successful. He's got a ruling body of a dozen or so men in his brotherhood who it's a council, and they seem to have the best interests of the population at heart. But Zoroastro is convinced that they can't. The future cannot go on this way, that the world must keep developing, and what has to happen is a form of government where he wants to hand over the government to Pamina and Tamino, the heroine and hero, saying that it's the love that exists between a man and a woman, which is actually the core of governing. And it's not a romantic notion, a giggly thing. He's saying, basically, to put it a little bit too briefly, that if the Creator gave as a gift to mankind love, something beyond just getting enamored and having your hormones, go crazy, and you end up proposing to somebody, and 10 or 15 years later you can't figure out the excitement's gone out of the marriage. You can't figure out what you're doing. That's not, that's a view of love, where the Greek gods get to sit around and giggle and about these silly humans and you have operas written about that type of thing. The serious thing Mozart was putting forward and he put forward this Magic Flute opera in 1791. He was also very much involved at that point in what was happening in Europe. And the court in Europe had spent 10 years. Let me say this. The outbreak of optimism from the American Revolution in Europe between 1781 and 83, for example, in Austria with the Emperor Joseph II, he wasn't going to stop being an emperor and turn everything over to a republic, but he adopted what you call American type reforms. He decided, he freed the serfs. He figured out the way you're going to have a stable kingdom wasn't just tax farming serfs on backward with a few rich nobility. Instead, he started putting monies into public hospitals so people would live longer, freeing the serfs so that the challenge to the plantation owners were the same as after the American Civil War, that if you can make money and have good farming if you had better skilled operations. And with the latest scientific breakthroughs going on, being brought into the farming techniques. Joseph II gave rewards and patents and rewards to inventors, including the man that Zoroaster was modeled after, Ignaz von Born, a close friend of Mozart's. So this was, and in the 1780s, what was the culture? Every 2 weeks for 10 years in a row, on average, every 2 weeks, the Mozart and Haydn produced a major work, a major musical cultural work. It was wildly popular. And not a small, they produced a lot more than that. But there was such a demand for works of music that didn't simply entertain, but by challenge people's identity and challenge their assumptions and made people feel good about themselves for being able to concentrate for longer periods of time. I'll say, so this Magic Flute opera that Beethoven seized upon was composed in 1791. It was a wild success. It was in the people's language, German. It wasn't an Italian opera meant for just the court theater and the aristocrats who knew Italian. It worked on several levels, but the core of it was the struggles of Pamina and Tamino to go through a series of trials to become worthy. And Beethoven seized upon this with his Leonora, who is Adrian Lafayette, who goes into the prison. She had to get into the prison. How's she going to save her husband? She's not 100% sure he's even in this particular prison, but she dresses up as a man, and she tries to get a job as a prisoner, as a guard in the prison. And she succeeds in doing that. And at the, she has no guaranteed plan for how she's going to get her husband out of there. She just knows she has to act on the basis of her love. And what Beethoven does is he puts a whole new scene into the libretto that he's gotten. He changes the libretto. It's a scene called Miriam Wunderbar. People listen to it, they'll think it's just a wonderful little 4-part canon where the different voices, you marvel how each character comes in on top of the other one and sings their own part, and it all works together so nicely. But it's actually something very horrible is going on. Yet what Beethoven thinks his audience needs to be confronted with is that Leonora does not know how she's going to get her husband out. She's dressed up as a man, and all of a sudden, all sorts of problems have appeared, because it turns out the chief jailer, the boss that she's now been hired by, Rocco, his daughter, Marceline, is now fallen in love with her, thinking that she's a man. And, so that's going to go nowhere. But that means Marceline has thrown over her suitor, another guard named Giacchino. So you have Giacchino, Marceline, and Rocco all singing these domestic things. Marceline's in love. Giacchino's upset that he's being thrown over. And Rocco, the father of the woman, he's happy that she's in love, and he's going to work things out and have all this domestic nonsense. And Leonora's tortured. She's now got to work herself through this imbroglio of extra problems she didn't want to have to deal with. And I'll just say today, if anybody actually decides to organize people for tomorrow's conference, you run into all sorts of people with all their domestic nonsense. I was going to play golf. I got this. I'm not that person. Why should I listen to that? And it recurs day in and day out. But just to go back to, so Beethoven a year earlier was horrified by his own oncoming deafness. And he wrote a letter to his 2 brothers. And this is totally pertinent to this scene in the opera. He wrote a letter to his 2 brothers. It's called the Heiligenstadt Testament, because he was that summer in a place called Heiligenstadt. And I'll just read a little passage from the Heiligenstadt Testament. And it's on the theme of the loneliness, the intense loneliness, if you decide to step forward and make history. It's what drives most people into the idea, I'm a nice person, I'll vote for the right person, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go there. So what the passage is, he's writing to his 2 brothers, born with an ardent and lively temperament, even susceptible to the diversions of society, I was compelled early to isolate myself, to live in loneliness. For me, there can be no recreations in society of my fellows, refined intercourse, mutual exchange of thought. He loved to hang around the beer halls and have discussions on political activities. Only just as little as the greatest needs command may I mix with society. I must instead live like an exile. And he goes on to describe, he's walking in the meadow one time with a musician friend, and the musician friend hears birds doing a melody and points it out, and Beethoven cannot hear it, and he can't admit that, a composer can't admit that he can't hear. He's 33 years old. So anyhow, he continues, such incidents brought me to the verge of despair, but little more, and I would have put an end to my life. Only art it was that withheld me. It seemed impossible to leave the world until I had produced all that I felt called upon me to produce. And so I endured this wretched existence. Divine One, thou lookest into my inmost soul, thou knowest it, thou knowest that love of man and desire to do good live therein. So people, for the rest of his days, people thought Beethoven was a misanthrope, lonely, cynical. He wasn't. He lived almost a martyr's life, and he composes this into Leonore. He wants the population to see Leonore, what she's saying, what she's singing in this quartet, while these others are, is totally something totally different. You know, it's how agonizing her mission is, that she doesn't know how to solve, but she's got to suffer this intense loneliness. So anyhow, there's other things Beethoven composes into the opera. The key thing, he puts William Pitt, the British foreign minister, on stage. His name is Pizarro. You know, the opera staged in a whole different period in history in Spain, a couple centuries earlier. Pizarro,
and that's a kind of a pun on words that reminds me of Jonathan Swift, and really, I mean, that's beautiful. I appreciate these things. This kind of makes my mind happy.
So he changes another thing about in the libretto. Pizarro is just a speaking role. He doesn't sing in the original opera. Okay. In Beethoven's opera, he turns Pizarro into somebody who sings, which is not the obvious thing to do for a guy who's really evil. He's the guy who's well, in particular, he's vowed to murder Florestan, Leonore's husband. He's the one who's condemned him to the lowest, dankest cell in the bottom, in isolation. All the other prisoners are political prisoners too, but they're in the upper parts of the prison. They're just they commingle with others. So he's the real enemy, and he's vowed that he has to murder. And he when he sings, you just got to hear how Beethoven puts somebody who sings evil, how evil sings. It's not a simple task, because you don't just make it an ugly voice like you do today. And so at one point he sings that moment, that Augenblick, that sudden moment, is the blink of an eye. When he gets to thrust that knife into Florestan, who otherwise is going to sooner or later rat out Pizarro for being, the enemy of the state, committing evil. So he's gonna kill that guy beforehand. It's gonna be such tremendous joy, Schadenfreude, to plunge that knife into him. And the word Augenblick gets associated for the audience with the most awful image. By the end of the opera, and Beethoven does this deliberately, at the point where, I'll give it away, she does save her husband. She does confront Pizarro, whips out a gun, and at the point, but at the moment, in front of all the other prisoners, and all the wives have gathered to see the evil governor of the prison, Pizarro, taken away. She's given the keys to unlock the chains on her husband, and as the chains drop away, it's Augenblick again. And Beethoven's music, it's like the biblical "in a twinkling of an eye." All of a sudden, this evil notion of, sudden evil being carried out is totally transformed into musically. It's I don't know whether it takes 1 minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. It's like timeless. He takes this sudden twinkling of an eye, biblical twinkling of an eye, and just stretches it out musically. He has the power to take that emotional state and to sustain it, so you can't walk away from it. You find yourself not just having a one sudden moment of love that everybody experiences. You see their kid or their grandkid do something beautiful, and you just get happy for a moment. This thing is that moment extended and drawn out, and is Beethoven taking you into a world that doesn't exist yet. It's a world that can exist, where people are actually happy about the development of their friends and neighbors, and they don't see themselves getting ahead simply by stepping on the shoulder or the head of their neighbor or some other country. They just think differently, and you get that in how Beethoven's command of the music works. I guess the only other thing I'll mention about Beethoven's treatment of the thing is what she is singing in that original quartet I'm talking about, when she's going through all the loneliness. The key phrase is "Namenlose Pein," a nameless pain. It's a pain doesn't even have a name to it. She's never experienced this type of pain of going into a situation she's being drawn into simply because she's in love with her husband and can't see living life any other way. She has to try to save him. And that nameless pain at the end of the opera becomes namenlose Freude, nameless joy. And it's also this moment where, we go from the beginning of the opera to the end. There's a key scene in the middle, which changes Leonore. She's a good person. She's a noble. She's giving her all, but she's doing it to save her husband. And in the middle of the opera, she witnesses all the prisoners given a moment, except for her husband, who's still. All the prisoners are let up for a momentary period to get light and air for the first time in years. And it's called the Prisoners' Chorus. And she's moved to tears watching the humanity of these men come to the fore in this beautiful chorus. And when she goes down, when she's allowed to go down with Rocco, she's allowed to go down to where her husband is, because Pizarro is about to murder him, and they're supposed to go down. The two of them are supposed to go down there and dig a grave in the cistern. And it's easy to dig a grave there because of where piss and manure, and that's where her husband's been kept. And that's her job, to go down there and do that. So it's a heart-wrenching scene. But her love for her husband has now been transformed to love. She realizes that her husband's been thrown in prison unfairly, but so has all these other people. And now her love for her husband, so she goes down there. She's ready to rescue this poor man who she cannot see the face. He's lying on the floor, and she'll rescue him regardless whether he's her husband. He's just a poor man who's there unjustly. And now she's acting on motives, universal and historical motives. So these are the main elements that Beethoven does in this dramatic story. I can't convey the music side of it. People just have to go convince themselves of that. But I'll just, to tie it with Friedrich Schiller, he really did believe that a great moment in history has found a little people, that the rage in the French population had been successfully organized. And people today should just stop being in a rage about Biden or Trump or whatever else, whatever other social media nonsense they're supposed to get, triggered about. They should just start enjoying how to think, and that will happen tomorrow. It's not just a matter of being against idiots who say that climate change, the same people who said that the world was getting too cold in the 1970s, and you give us funding money to prove that human activity is making the world too cold, we have to stop industry. And then they found out, well, maybe the measurements weren't proving it. So they all changed over and said, all right, so all the now the world, human activity is making the world get too hot. And so we just have to stop human activity. And if they were just honest, they would say, we think human beings are schmucks. We think human beings are not much different than beasts. They don't have a better side to them. The best you can do is cull the human herd. This is Prince Philip. These are people way higher up than the people you've been having to choose for president the last many years. These people are Malthusians. They believe that human creativity doesn't exist. Therefore, the more people you have, the worse it is. The more mouths you have to feed. You have limited resources. So if you have little people acting on that basis, you're caught in that world. LaRouche's connection to Beethoven, thinking like Beethoven, and Friedrich Schiller, is that or Abraham Lincoln appealing to the better angel of people's natures. This is what leaders do, and you don't do it blindly. Saying, I expect people to act great as soon as I say something nice about them and give them a big challenge. This is what John Kennedy said when you and I were young, John. Don't ask what the country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. That's not a slave thing. People actually believed the United States was the best hope for mankind back in the 50s and 60s. We weren't perfect, but leaders could ask that of people. And this was Friedrich Schiller's critique. Don't expect to have good political results unless you're willing to make that fight. The same fight people do make for their own kids if they're decent parents. You don't react to your kids by some momentary childish thing your kid does. You're in there for the long haul because you believe that kid can be as good or better than you, has potential. And you can't treat all your fellow citizens as your own kid. You can't spank them, you can't discipline them, but you have to act to them with that long-range thing in mind. And Friedrich Schiller did with poetry what Beethoven did with music. So that's
great.
That's my version of that.
I've just been lapping it all up. It's been a joy for me. And speaking of joy, you've used that word at the end of Fidelio, the
Freude,
Augenblick of
yeah.
Freude, and we also, of course, have the famous anthem of the Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy, or Freude in German, and perhaps that's something I would ask you to tell me a little bit more about. What exactly is Freude to Beethoven and Schiller, and how should we think of that word?
Sure. Small point first. I mean, Beethoven actually inserted, another one of the changes he made in the libretto was that he inserted some lines from Schiller's poem, the Ode to Joy, into the opera, specifically sort of this magic flute type point. The lines were about, he who has found a lovely wife can join this universal band of brotherhood. That the test of whether or not you don't have wives simply to have sex or to have a family or to be entertained. It's actually in the small, the test of whether or not you're committed to acting toward mankind with your better nature, So Beethoven actually inserted at the end of the opera when everything's being very celebratory. Beethoven weds this Schiller idea because that's the opera. It's or amor conjugal, married love. Beethoven weds this image of Leonora finally being reunited with her husband Florestan. It's so clear when you see the effect it has on all the population around them, all the other husbands and wives who are finally being reunited also. It's sort of, I guess in our lifetimes, it's sort of like when you saw the Berlin Wall coming down or something similar like that. Beethoven had a lifelong fascination with that poem, Ode to Joy. He doesn't finally, it's what you said, it's the core of his Ninth Symphony of 1823 or 1824, I'm forgetting. But Beethoven had a mission to set the Ode to Joy to music all his life. He writes about this early on. In German, Freude you can what Schiller does. You can associate Freude with Freunde, a friendship, a friend. So it's this issue that humanity really is social. It's not just the wife; it's also true friendship, and you can. So the connection of Freude and Freunde is very. In English, it doesn't quite work to say joy and friend. You don't automatically associate the two as closely related, but that's what Schiller's playing upon in the poem, among other things. And Beethoven, fundamentally related to this. So what can you say about this revolutionary thing that Beethoven does? This is after the Congress of Vienna in 1814, 1815 started out with the possibility, with Napoleon being defeated, that Europe could get beyond the last 20, 25 years of the failed French Revolution and then take up the issue that they've been diverted from, which is, can you have an American form of government in Europe? Now, it absolutely did not happen. Beethoven actually recomposed his original opera, his only opera, Leonora. It's known today as Fidelio because in 1814 he recomposed it and it was renamed Fidelio. And in fact, there are links on my article where you can hear both the original opera, which is about 90% the same as the rewritten one. And he did it for the Congress of Vienna to try to educate these princes coming in to decide about the fate of Europe. It was a magnificent failure. It didn't happen. The Congress of Vienna ended up with a very anti-American the Triple Alliance, they called it. All sorts of regressive, repressive measures were put in place. Beethoven really stopped writing any music for large groups of people from 1815 to 1822, 1823. He was taken aback. He was thrown on his heels. He did some very beautiful things, but the things you had big public events for did not happen. 1822 to 1824, the Miss of Solemnus, which the Schiller Institute is working on presently for the proper reflection of the 20th anniversary of 9/11 coming up in a few weeks. That was unlike any other mass in history. The Miss of Solemnus was a product of that period, and the Ninth Symphony. And they were. I don't want to say Beethoven got cynical about the possibilities of pushing society forward, but in a certain sense, these pieces were written, yes, for the population of the time, but also in a certain sense for the populations that had to come in the future, lest the world not make it. Either they were going to come around to a competent cultural level, or they were going to make it. So what do people know? Beethoven writes 3 gorgeous movements of music without any voices in it. And in a symphony, the last movement all of a sudden opens up, reminding people what the exciting, the gripping first movement, what the wild second movement, what the unheimlich, what the magnificent beauty. It's another one of these Augenblick moments where he stretches out beauty beyond what you can possibly imagine. You just have to hear one of these things, and you can't imagine a fourth movement that's going to surpass this. But what he does is he quotes themes from the first movement, and the voices say, "Not that, not good enough." And then he quotes the second movement, "Not good enough." And then the gorgeous third movement. You think come on, you're not going to reject that. And it's not good enough. And it's what possibly could be good enough. And then is when he introduces the Freude, the Schiller poem, cite the selections he made from the poem, Ode to Joy. People know this, but again, listen to there's all sorts of beautiful melodies people relate to from popular music in their teenage years. You can get Elvis Presley tunes or whatever else. The problem with them is you don't understand why they're beautiful. You can have an emotional connection to it, but you're not allowed to have that get some perspective on why something you relate to emotionally. And classical music has that power. And let me put it this way. What's classical about classical music is not that it's for old fogies. It's there's a fundamental coherence between God and man. People may be cynical about that. They may think babies die too young. There can't be a God. Well, why do we have diseases? Why is my neighbor so stupid? Why did that guy cut me off in traffic? This world cannot be composed by a God. There's no good order to it. And that's not the way Mozart, Beethoven thought. Classical music, the opening theme presents an interesting idea, but who cares about that? That's not why it's done. It's done because of the possibilities of development, of turning it upside down, turning it backwards, working the thing in dozens of ways. It's like looking at a beautiful quartz crystal and turning it and seeing how light reflects on differently through it. It's much richer than people think. It's not one-dimensional. And this is, sorry, I'm not looking at the camera. And this is what Beethoven does with this Ode to Joy theme. I'll say one last thing about it, because there's something bizarre happens. You have this glorious development. It builds and it builds and it builds, and you say, oh my God, I never knew this little bit of material had such possibilities. It really is like a teenager when they're in love. They think anything's possible. They can become, this girl will only, pay attention to me and love me. I could do anything. I could become president. I could make the world perfect. But this theme has this, and all of a sudden it breaks off. You think, what the heck? And you get this semi-vulgar entrance. You just have this bassoon going off beat, off kill, like a drunk German peasant. It just goes boom, 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 boom. the and you say, well, and Beethoven's out to prove that you don't have to have 17 years of college to have this music speak to you. That and you watch what this material that he does, that this German peasant introduces, how that gets folded in to the process. And you think, how did he do that? I would have never guessed that piece of semi-vulgarity walking into the on stage there had any place to do with so musicologists will say 100 other things beside the obvious, but that's you can't listen to that without, as they say, what do they say in the old cornflakes commercial, taste it again for the first time. People should just let Beethoven speak to you. Don't be worried if you don't understand every little thing. It's very, very rich. It's done by a person who's a master of the invisible world of the human mind and soul. It's a lawful world. Just because it's not visible and you can't have the sureness that one of your five senses can document it and you can tell your friend exactly what, you can't put it on a computer program, but it exists. It's real. And classical music takes a theme and shows its connection to the whole. The way the philosopher that Schiller and Beethoven studied, Gottfried Leibniz, and a favorite of Lyndon LaRouche, the way he put it, Gottfried Leibniz, was in every smallest part of the universe is a mirror of the whole universe. Admittedly, it takes a trick sometimes to figure out why some things exist in the world, but the world is that rich. And that's how classical music works. That makes it different from any other music that's called music.
Well, this has just been a thrilling evening for me. I really have enjoyed it, and I think folks that have been watching and listening along can feel the enthusiasm that you have as a professional musician, as well as a deep thinker about political philosophy and our country and where things are going. And the big thing to me that I take out of this is, honestly, I never really thought of the opera Magic Flute in terms of Pamina and Tamino being the central characters, and that having been fostered by Sarastro to create a new type of political leadership, which Beethoven carries further in his Lenora and Fidelio, to the point where you wrap it up very neatly by saying this is a conjugal harmony. It sounds like a new kind of Freemasonry that's centered around a man and a woman, and the joy that I think comes from real love of beyond the mechanical side of it that you described, but the real love that happy are you that has what was it, the successful person
who's found a lovely wife. I'm butchering the English translation of the German.
Yeah,
but it's close.
But that's amazing. I mean, I'm let's start a country where you have to be a married couple to run for president. I mean, imagine whether that would get anything done or not. But the hearts would be in the right place. The center to look at politics from the point of view of a marital relationship being the core of the political system.
It sort of gets to the point. The Freemasons, this is a whole nother hour show, but
no, let's not go there right now. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go
Mozart's polemic was that the mystery type stuff on the Freemasons is not. He was part of a particular group that fought to get something that could appeal to Catholics, Jews, Protestants, the universal quality there. It wasn't just Catholics versus Masons. Either you went with the Catholics or you went with the opposition party. And so you had to figure out how to get under people's skin. The problem is the roster had, that was the best Masonic grouping you could possibly have. It's no secret. That's what that part of the opera is about. But it's saying Zoroaster knows that that's not the way. You can't just have well-meaning leadership, even if they're well-meaning for forever and a day. In reality, the policies you have to implement, like building fusion energy and plasma physics, are going to require massive transformation of your population's capacities, like the United States has done in good parts of our history. And so you can't just have, you actually have to engage your population. You have to get people to take seriously that they really are human. And part of that is you really do have these love impulses, which is partly about sex and hormones, but it's not reduced to that. So people have to reflect upon why this gift, this tremendous gift in creation, has been given to people. And people, I'll put it the other way around. People don't deserve to be in love if they don't want to be a good Republican citizen, small r Republican citizen. And they're not going to be able to form decent relationships if the civilization keeps going the other way. Kids don't have reasons to make long-term decisions about their own intellectual development, their own social development. They get the message that just live for yourself. Life doesn't really have a meaning. So calculate how long you're going to be around and try to get the most entertainment you can out of that. And, so there was a underlying reason that polemic was made in the Magic Flute about what it meant that people could form stable long-term relationships.
I think this is really, really golden stuff that we've been doing tonight, David. A lot of people, myself included, would like to go and talk about Magic Flute and the pyramids of Egypt and the Masonic connections of the time. If you'd be so kind as to come back, we could maybe spend that hour or at least part of it going into that. Would you do that?
Sure. If you promised, if we do the abduction from the Seraglio, which is really Mozart's immediate response to the American Revolution, if you promised to sing Osmian, at least one aria.
Wer ein Liebchen hat gefunden, die es treu und freundlich macht. I can't remember the words, but yeah, you know this tune.
Sure, whenever you can arrange it. But tomorrow, prepare yourself for any more cultural matters by 9 o'clock in the morning. There's no climate emergency.
This has been a theme of mine for years and years and years, and now we've got an opportunity to really bring the message home with a group of dedicated scientists and dedicated writers like David and the whole Schiller Institute behind it. So tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I plan to be there, and I hope to see you all there too. Thanks,
Thank
David.
you, John.
Thanks, everybody, and have a great evening.